So I will be the last speaker before the coffee break, and I'll say a little bit about individual differences in brain maturation trajectories, and also related a little bit to some cognitive functions. So just a little bit about what brain maturation is. Then brain maturation, it's a really complex ongoing process that occurs throughout childhood and into adolescence and even into early adulthood. And it's characterized by a lot of different biological processes, such as synaptic pruning, myelination, and also an increase in axon diameter. MR studies have shown that there's widespread maturation across the entire brain, and that includes changes in gray and white matter, changes in cortical thickness, and there's also some microstructural changes. And this is from Terry, actually. So it's just showing in a cross-sectional study how the cortex is maturing. And we have here a cortex area, surface of the area, then cortical thickness and volume. Here we have age from 4 to 20 years, and then it shows how the annualized rate of change. So if it's yellow or red, then it means that it's increasing up to 2%, or if it's blue, then it's decreasing. And what we can see is that, for instance, with cortical thickness, then from the age of 4 and onwards, it's actually getting thinner and thinner, whereas the surface area is actually expanding up to around the age of 10 to 12, and then getting slightly smaller. Volume is a little bit of a mixture between these two, so it's a lot more complex. So there's also longitudinal studies out, and some of them have shown that there's this S-shaped developmental trajectory of cortical thickness in adolescence, so it's actually speeding up a little bit cortical thinning in adolescence. So while we know a lot about how the brain is maturing at the group level, we actually don't know very much about how the different individuals are different in how the rate of change or how the brain is maturing. So there's, for instance, one study here where they have 3 time points, but they're actually just comparing the first and second time point and second and third time point. And here it's cortical thickness, so it's basically saying how many percent change there is between 2 time points at a certain age. And what we can see here is also that looks like that's speeding a little bit up in adolescence with the changes. However, this also doesn't really say that much about whether there's individual differences in the developmental trajectories. It just says something about differences in slope. So I'll say a little bit about the Hooper project. So the Hooper project started back in 2007, and it was actually Terry who initiated it, and other children. Or it could also be that there's differences in the shape of how the brain is developing, so the trajectories of it. So I'll say a little bit about a study we got out last year. It's called the midpoint of cortical thinning between late childhood and early adulthood, and it's basically based on our 12-wave sample. Getting a little nerdy on the modeling, basically what we are modeling is this kind of logistic function. So we have, so to capture that S-shaped development that we saw in cortical thickness. And what we're really interested in is this point, which is the inflection point. So it's basically the time point where the cortex is thinning the most rapid. But we also get upper and lower asymptotes out, and we also have the slope in the model. So it's a lot of different parameters you can get out here. So we have 90 children, and the average number of scans is 8.3, which is a lot of scans because we need at least 4 scans to be able to do this kind of nonlinear longitudinal modeling. One of the interesting things, and I think this is actually one of the first studies coming out showing how big the individual differences are in developmental, or in when individuals reach different developmental milestones in a way. So on average, this is just for the entire cortex, for the cortical thickness. Then they reached it on average around the age of 14, but there's quite a big variability across individuals. So some individuals reach it when they are 12 years and others when they are 19 years. And we showed the variability down here. We can also look at the different brain regions, and we use FreeSurfer, and one of the common atlases in FreeSurfer. So over here, we've actually color-coded the time or the age of the midpoint of cortical thinning. So if it's more light, it's something that happens early, and if it's dark, then it happens late. And what we can see is that some of the earlier maturing regions seems to be here in the rostral middle frontal cortex and also in the parietal lobe, whereas some of the really late maturing regions is here in the anterior and cingulate and also the parahippocampal cortex. So one thing is that related to slope? So could it be that those that have a faster maturing cortical thinning, that they actually have reached this time point earlier or later, and it doesn't seem to be the case. They're not really correlated, and one way we can see that also is that here we have two regions next to each other. They seem to reach the MCT at around the same time point, but when we look here, then one of the regions have a really steep slope, whereas the other ones don't. All the regions here is, you can see the individual variability over here, and there's some of the regions that seems to be really variable, but I don't think that that's because they necessarily are that biological variability. This is actually a region that's really hard to estimate with MRI, and there's a lot of noise in that region. Another thing we could ask with the data is, so is there regions in the brain that seem to co-mature with other brain regions? So for instance, if you are mature in one brain region, does that mean that your entire brain is also mature, or is it certain regions in the brain that co-mature? And we see that it comes out with a factor analysis with two factors. So we have these regions seem to be co-maturing. So we have like parts of the insula, or the insula, and some of the inferior frontal gyrus, the central regions, and a little bit of the temporal regions and limbic regions that seem to be maturing together. And here we have more like the frontal, parietal, and temporal regions maturing together. Then I'll move to the next study, and that's diffusion-weighted imaging. It's still in HUBO. Now we only have 76 participants, and it's because they go through a lot of quality checks when we scan the children. So it's not everything, even though they might go successful through a scan, it could be that they've been moving or there's something else wrong with the scan. So we lose some data. We've also lost quite a lot of data because they have dental braces on, and you can see that quite a lot on the diffusion-weighted imaging, but not that much necessarily on the structural imaging. So here we have between 7 and 19 years, and we have approximately 9 scans per individual. Now it gets a little nerdy again with the modeling. We're using something called GAM, and the reason we're using that is because it really fits the type of data we have, so it can handle unbalanced longitudinal data really well. That means that we have different ages at baseline, we have different time point, the number of time points, or even the interval between the time points can differ. And what is good with the GAM is that we actually don't have a priori to say how the shape of the trajectory looks like. The GAM uses splines and it will figure it out, so it's much more data-driven when it comes to determining how the shape of the trajectories are. We look at a lot of different regions, but I'm only going to show a few of them. So in general, and what has also been reported in literature, is that in all regions we see increases in FA with age, and we see decreases in MD with age. And I think there's been enough about FA and MD to not mention what it is. So this is pretty stereotypical, so we put males in blue and females in red. So one of the things that we can see is that there's obvious sex differences. So females seems to level off earlier than males. They reach a plateau, whereas in males we see a much more linear developmental trajectories within this age range. We also looked at individual differences. So the first thing we wanted to look at was if we could detect any shape differences, and we weren't able to find any significant shape differences. One of the reasons could also be that you can probably see this is spaghetti plots, so this is one individual, and you can see the data is quite noisy. So of course that also has some influence on what we are able to find. So since there wasn't any shape differences, then we can move on and say they all have similar-ish trajectories, and then we could look if there's any slope differences, and we could see there was up to 4% slope differences within this age range. But the main differences basically in the intercept. So if you have high FA or low MD, you will continue having a high FA or low MD over time, at least again from 7 years and up. One of the things I think is really interesting in this data is that if we take these kinds of spaghetti plots and make them into annualized rate of change, so percentage change, and again the red is the females and blue is males, then one thing that we can see is that something happens in the females around age 12 to 14, where they go basically from having here 1% annual change down to none. So that's also within the age range where we have the first period in Denmark, so that's 13 years. So an obvious question is then, so how is this related to puberty? And one of the pubertal measures we have is actually the age of menarche. And there was actually a significant age by menarche interaction effect, meaning that puberty seems to actually have an influence on the developmental trajectories in females. Just to wrap some of this up, then we see that there's definitely individual differences in the asymptotes, meaning that you have either higher FA or lower MD or larger brains, for instance, and that stays relatively stable. We do not see phase variability, so that was this one. We don't see that in the diffusion data, but we saw that in cortical thickness with the age being shifted for the midpoint of cortical thinning. And when it comes to shape and slope variability, then we definitely see that males and females differ in shape and in slope. We're not able to find shape differences in the individual level, but we do see that there's minor slope differences in brain microstructure and definitely something in the cortical thinning. So one obvious question is also that we have all these developmental trajectories, but is it, does it mean anything? Is it related to some kind of behavior or illness and so on? And in HUBO we have a lot of cognitive data, and one of them is a response inhibition task. So I don't know how many of you know about response inhibition, so I'm just going to say a little bit about it in the beginning. So response inhibition, that's the ability to withhold a planned or prepotent manual response. It's really important for normal behavior. And we also see deficits in a lot of different psychiatric disorders, such as ADHD and OCD. There's a lot of different types of response inhibition tasks. Some of the most used are the go-no-go task or the stop-signal task. And in our study, we used the stop-signal task. And it's something that continues to develop throughout childhood and into adolescence. Here's one from Terry's group also, where we can see that a measure of response inhibition actually improves, so it gets lower with time. It's reaction time, so it's better to have a low reaction time. At least here from 4 to 12 years. Stop signal task is a task that's really well studied in the literature, so it's also pretty well studied what kind of system, brain system is involved in it. And there's so many studies out showing that it's a right lateralized frontal-basal ganglia network implicated. And it involves the inferior frontal gyrus, the pre-supplementary motor area, and also the subthalamic nucleus. And interesting, these regions are actually interconnected, meaning that they actually do go together as a system, and it's important to look at them as a system. The stop-signal task we use is something called CANTOP, or it's a complete test battery, but it's the stop-signal task on that. And it works in a way that the children sit in front of a computer and they have like a response box and they use their index fingers. So they see first a circle, and then after 500 milliseconds, an arrow appears and it points either left or right. If it points left, they press on the left button, and if it points right, they press on the right button. They're instructed to do this as fast as possible, but then in 25% of the cases, they hear a sound afterwards. And if they hear the sound, then they're not supposed to press the button. And we can vary when the sound is, so sometimes the sound will come real close to the arrow, and it's really easy to inhibit, and sometimes it comes much later, and then it's really, really difficult to inhibit. It's an adaptive task, so it actually fits the child's performance. And we are actually able to figure out how much time we need to be able to inhibit a plant response. So we get something out called the stop signal reaction time. And a shorter stop signal reaction time, or SSRT, that means that they're better at inhibiting. So in our baseline study, we found that better response inhibition that was associated with higher FA in the white matter underlying both the right inferior frontal gyrus and also the right pre-supplementary motor area. And interesting, that was actually also after correcting for age, which is really important because you have a developing cohort where you know that FA is actually increasing with age, and we also know performance is increasing with age. So if you do not correct for age, you would probably find an association, even though it might not be there, similarly to if you had looked at height and some kind of cognitive function. We also try to adjust for global white matter FA, and that's quite important if you want to say something about that it's specific for this system and not just general development. And it still survives with that in. So for I'm just gonna, sorry, just skipping quickly to the longitudinal results. So in the longitudinal data set, we have either 2 to 9 assessments, and assessments mean it's pairing up the diffusion-weighted imaging and the stop signal task. And it's 6.6 assessments on an average. And what we could see is that the response inhibition performance, it reaches adults level around the age of 12 to 13. And another interesting thing is that if we take the initial performance and the baseline of first follow-up, and then divide them into groups saying like who is poor performers, who are good performance, and who are in the middle, then we can actually see that they catch up. So the poor performers actually catch up with the good performers, but it happens maybe 2 or 3 years later. So if we look at the system that is brain system that is involved and the pre-SMA, then we can actually see that if we do the same thing for the pre-SMA, we don't see this catch-up. It could be they're catching up out here after the age of 19. We don't know because we don't have that data. But at least here we can definitely see that there's stable individual differences in the data in the pre-SMA FA. And what we found was that was a significant age by pre-SMA FA interaction effects. And what does that mean? That means that children that have a high, already have high FA in the pre-SMA, they actually show less improvements. They seem to already be performing this task pretty good, whereas those that have low FA, they actually see a lot more improvements with age. And it suggests that you need to reach some kind of certain maturity level in this region before you can actually perform this task at a maximum level. Then for the last 5 to 10 minutes, I will say a little bit about a new study that we have that will be starting up very soon. It's called the NIPCP, and it's funded by Elsersfonden. So we already heard a little bit about CP earlier today, cerebral palsy earlier today. And in Denmark, the diagnostic age is approximately around 11 months. But it's actually possible to lower that age. We also heard that earlier. And the 3 most important tools for that, that's cerebral MRI, it's the general movement assessment, and it's the Hammersmith infant neurological examination. So we also heard a lot about imaging of infants and toddlers, and in Denmark it's typically, we often do that in anesthesia or some kind of sedation, especially when they are more than 1 month old. But in research setting we have actually been doing, like Marisa and Brittany, for instance, have been doing, not for 20 years though, you're not that old, but they've been doing a lot of research scans without any EA or sedation, just during natural sleep. And it sounds like it might be something that it's feasible to do, but it's actually really, really complex to do. You have to take a lot of things into account, so it's quite challenging. And it's actually not something we have the setup for in Denmark at the moment, neither in research nor in the clinic. So the NIPCP, the study aims and objectives, that is first of all that we want to establish procedures and workflows to actually do this kind of infant and toddler imaging during natural sleep, so not using any sedation or general anesthesia at 2 of the hospitals in Denmark, so that would be at Hvidovre Hospital and Rigshospitalet. We also want to implement advanced MRI sequences to scan infants and toddlers, and with advanced MRI sequences, I mean advanced multi-shell diffusion-weighted imaging, some more myelin-sensitive methods, and spectroscopy. And it's likely that this method actually would be more sensitive to pick up some of the brain injuries and damage that we don't see necessarily on the conventional diagnostic structural MRI. So we also want to extend the CP-EDIT study with longitudinal MR scans. And the CP-EDIT study is a new study, a nationwide study on cerebral palsy. And we will actually add longitudinal MRI to that study. And next to that, we'll also initiate a new typically developing cohort of infant toddlers. And we do that because we want to establish a normative material for early development in Danish children, and that will be an open data set. We also want to conduct something called normative modeling, and so we can basically model what is typical and what is atypical early development. It's equivalent to growth charts in children, and it will inform us a little bit more about how the individual child is deviating from the norm. We will also map how early brain development is related to motor function, both motor function and motor development. And that's really essential because we can then try and start using some of the early MRIs to actually say a little bit more about what kind of motor problems the infant or child might get when they get older. And then one of the goals is also all the knowledge that we gain, we will actually transfer that to the new child scanner when the new pediatric hospital starts in 2026. And ultimately the goal is to lower the diagnostic age of CP in Denmark. So for the first goal, then establishing imaging of infants during natural sleep. So Melanie and I have been in Dublin, and we also visited Brittany in Virginia to learn about the procedures of scanning infants, both awake but also during natural sleep. There's some images from, you can't see that, from Brittany's lab, and one from Dublin, where they're actually filming the children inside the scanner. It's quite complex. We've known that there's both soft skills and hard skills that we need to have. So all the soft skills about how to interact with the family, figuring out the baby when they're sleeping, having enough time, monitoring the baby, and so on. But we also need specialized MR equipment for it. So noise cancelling headphones, a camera inside the scanner, and so on. So status of this is that at Rigshospitalet they've had 4 scans so far, and 2 of them went successful. And in NIPCP we are currently piloting because we're also setting up all these advanced imaging protocols. A little bit about the cohort. I know this is not really it's a quite complex figure, but it's just trying to show that we have the CP-EDIT study and all the kinds of assessments they're doing in that. And then we have the NIPCP study over here that's sort of an add-on to the CP-EDIT. We expect to include 200 infants, where around 50 to 60 most likely will be high risk for cerebral palsy, and the rest will be typically developing children. And they will be assessed 3 times, so we'll have a baseline and that will fit with the CP-EDIT study. So we try to get a control group that is similar age as the CP-EDIT cohort. So we expect the baseline to be between 3 and 9 months. Then we'll have a 12-month follow-up and one when the babies are 24 months. They will get a lot of advanced MRI, and then they'll also get a lot of motor and neurological tasks. Yeah, it's just showing what will be included. And then a little bit about the normative material. So getting the reason why we want to get all that normal data or typically developing data is because we also want to do normative modeling. And it's equivalent to these kind of growth charts. And then instead we'll use the brain to be able to say something about how you're deviating in your brain development from the norm. And then using that, you can actually say a little bit more about how the prospects will be for an individual child and how it's actually deviating. Yeah. And then, yeah, a lot of people have been involved in HUBU and in NIPCP, and they're on here, and also all the funding. And yeah, that was it. Thanks.